When we last left off, World War II had just begun with the Nazis and the Soviets splitting Poland in half. This time, I want to talk about what's going on in the United States. Well, in the 1930s, the United States had kept out of international affairs in order to focus its energies on solving problems caused by the Great Depression. This is something everyone's dealing with. It's a global depression. This policy of isolationism, not getting involved in foreign affairs, is isolationism. Well, this policy also sprang up from a strong desire to avoid getting involved in another world war. And the U.S. stayed away from entangling alliances of the type that led to World War I. From 1935 through 1937, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts that forbid the U.S. from providing weapons or loans to nations at war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, he's on your dime, understood the public's desire to stay isolated. But he realized that the U.S. could not stand idly by and ignore the turmoil in Europe. As Nazi aggression increased in the late 1930s, public opinion started to shift. Most Americans still wanted to keep from getting involved, but they did want to find a way to help Britain and France stand up to Germany. Less than a month after the Nazis invaded Poland, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, asked Congress to revise the Neutrality Acts so that the U.S. could sell weapons to the Allies. The Allies of the U.S. were Britain and France. After his re-election in 1940, FDR introduced a new policy known as Lend-Lease, designed to continue the flow of military aid to Britain. The Lend-Lease program provided military aid to the U.S.'s allies, specifically Britain, France, later the Soviet Union, believe it or not. The British government by this time was nearly bankrupt, so FDR proposed to provide supplies without asking for payment in return. He sold the policy to the American public by using a clever metaphor, stating, quote, "If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sell him your hose, you lend it to him." End quote. Despite opposition from isolationist lobbies, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, providing the U.S. would lend or lease weapons and supplies to, quote, "any country whose defense was vital to the United States," end quote. In August 1941, Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Churchill met secretly on a warship off the coast of Newfoundland, agreeing to a set of war aims called the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter, the war aims of Britain and the U.S. These outlined the need for collective security, free elections, self-determination, post-war disarmament, and economic cooperation. It's basically Wilson's 14 points from World War I under Roosevelt, called the Atlantic Charter. Following Dunkirk, remember, Germany avoids the super trench in France, splits it down the middle, pushes the British to the coast, and they have to run away, hop on boats, and escape. That was Dunkirk. So following the escape of British troops from mainland Europe and the fall of France, France was left undefended. That was it. That was their defense. They had to leave because of Dunkirk. In 1940, this is June, the Italians and Nazis had declared war against France and Britain. And they attacked France from the south. On June 14th, Paris fell to the Germans. And on June 22nd, France surrendered to Germany. French General Charles de Gaulle fled to London. From there, he set up a government in exile and named himself the leader of the Free French. De Gaulle's government in England worked with clandestine guerrilla forces, that means spies, who were in France to free the country from the Germans in an effort collectively known as the Resistance. Much of Europe under Nazi control, Hitler turned his attention to Great Britain. His goal was to disable the Royal Air Force and then launch a land assault against the island nation. England is an island, so it's a little tricky to just march on in. So the first step was to knock out the Air Force and then send in the troops. So in June 1940, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, German Air Force, embarked on a sustained air campaign targeting England's biggest cities, especially London, the capital. The Battle of Britain lasted until May 1941. Many civilians died, and hundreds of buildings were reduced to rubble, as you can see in the picture. But the British eventually prevailed because of several factors. We're going to go over a couple of these. Why did the British win the Battle of Britain? Well, the development of radar. It was a new technology, and it allowed the British to know the number and how fast and the direction of incoming enemy warplanes. British anti-aircraft guns inflicted heavy losses on the German Air Force. Another reason Britain survived this attack, the skill of the British Air Force in defending the country kept losses from being more severe. British fighters ultimately managed to overcome their German counterparts. They were a better Air Force. One more reason why Britain was able to hold Germany off. Since most German attacks took place at night, the British government imposed a total blackout to ensure that the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, could not use lights from England's buildings to help them locate targets to bomb. Civilians used thick brick curtains or black paint to light-proof their windows, and cities refrained from using streetlights at night. In addition, the government set up several public air raid shelters that saved countless civilian lives. So in the Battle of Britain, the German Luftwaffe, the Air Force, lost a total of 1,733 aircraft, and the British Air Force, they only lost 915 specifically. Between September 1940 and May 1941, Germany dropped more than 35,000 tons of bombs. London alone was attacked 19 times with over 18,000 tons of bombs. When it became clear that Britain could not be subdued by bombing alone, Hitler changed his focus to Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean. He gave up. Britain won the Battle of Britain. Prime Minister Winston Churchill's words describe the sentiment of the population of England for the Air Force's defense against air raids. Never was so much owed by so many to so few. Hitler's obsession with expanding eastward, Lebensraum, breathing room, expansion eastward, would lead him to break his treaty with Stalin. Remember, they split Poland right before World War II began. In June 1941, the Germans began Operation Barbarossa. Early on, military strategists predicted that the Soviet army would be defeated in less than 2 months. The ensuing campaign was one of the deadliest in human history and lasted 4 years, as the German army attempted to destroy the Soviet Union's Red Army. With the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Winston Churchill announced that all who resist Nazi domination shall have our aid. So let's look at Japan real quick. The land war on the continent drew the Europeans' powers' attention away from protecting their colonies in East Asia. Japan took advantage of this opportunity to continue its policy of imperialist expansion it began with in China. In 1940, Japan launched an initiative known as Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, claiming it would free the region from European domination. In reality, Japan simply wished to substitute its own colonial rule for that of the Europeans. President Roosevelt had been alarmed by Japanese expansion in the East, Asia, and the Pacific Ocean, and took moves to slow Japan's efforts. In 1940, Roosevelt ended sales of steel and scrap iron to Japan. After Japan conquered French Indochina in 1941, Roosevelt cut off oil shipments to Japan and froze Japanese assets in U.S. banks. Both countries realized they were heading down the road to war. Japanese and American diplomats held meetings in 1941, trying to find a way to avoid conflict. Behind the scenes, however, Japan was already planning an attack. General Hideki Tojo, who advocated going to war with the U.S., became Japanese prime minister in October 1940. By November, Japan began moving a fleet across the Pacific toward Hawaii. We see here a picture of Hideki Tojo, the military dictator of Japan. It was his call to start the war with the United States with a sneak attack. On December 7th, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. This is in Hawaii. At the time, the base had nearly the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet. 2 hours after the attack began, 18 American ships had been sunk, including 8 battleships, decimating America's naval capacity. The attack also left over 2,400 Americans dead and another 1,000 wounded. The day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt addressed Congress and asked for a declaration of war with Japan, which was immediately approved. In a speech to Congress, Roosevelt said that December 7th, 1941 would be remembered as, quote, a date which will live in infamy, end quote. Since Japan was a member of the Tripartite Pact, Germany then declared war on the U.S. America reciprocated and declared war on Germany on December 11th. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill rejoiced at the U.S. Entry into World War II. Churchill says, "To have the United States at our side was to me the greatest joy. Now at this very moment I knew the United States was in the war, up to the neck and into the death." So we had won after all. Hitler's fate was sealed. Mussolini's fate was sealed. As for the Japanese, they would be ground to powder. End quote. And that's how the U.S. got pulled into World War II. These are your discussion questions for today's Google Forum post.